On the 12th of March 1994, two young boys, 10-year-old Elroy van Roy and his cousin Reno, left their home in Strand, Western Cape, to help push grocery trolleys at a local shopping centre in the hopes of earning a few rand in tips to spend on treats and arcade games. The boys worked for a while, and then Reno got hungry and went to a nearby shop to place an order for hot chips. While they waited for their food, they looked at one of the arcade game machines. The boys were approached by a man who offered them money to play a few games. They eagerly agreed and invited the man to join them. After enjoying their sponsored games, the boys collected their food and left the shop to sit on a nearby curb and eat. The man from the shop approached them again and asked if they could help him to carry some boxes to a nearby train station. He offered them 10 rand each for the effort. In 1994, to these two young boys, 10 rand would have seemed like a fortune, and they agreed to assist. Halfway to the train station, however, Reno became suspicious of the man, as he'd figured out that the boxes they were carrying were empty. He told Elroy they should leave. Both boys had heard stories about a man that was killing young boys. That wasn't happening in Strand though, Elroy reasoned. So while his cousin abandoned the mission and headed back to their home, Elroy continued on with the stranger. He didn't return home for dinner that night. Elroy's body was found a week later in Kleinvlei. The discovery of his body would be the key to ending a series of murders which had plagued the nearby community of Mitchell's Plain and surrounding communities for 8 years. Elroy van Roy was victim number 23 of the serial killer that had become known as the Station Strangler. The first recorded victim of the serial killer who would become known as the Station Strangler was in 1986. Jonathan Claassen was 14 years old. His body was found on the 3rd of October 1986 in the field surrounding Modderdam railway station. He had been sodomized, his hands tied behind his back, and his face was pushed into the sand. The cause of death was strangulation with a piece of his own clothing. This would become known as the modus operandi of the Station Strangler. Another 8 victims would be found before the 90s rolled in. The Station Strangler had committed 9 murders, and there was no sign of police on his trail. For 2 years, he seemed to control his compulsions, but in October 1992, his bloodlust took over once again. The killer seemingly went silent for another year, and then, in January 1994, all hell broke loose. The body of an unidentified child was found on the 13th of January 1994 in the Weltevrede dunes. The dunes were remote and desolate, sandy with enough shrubbery and vegetation that a body would not easily be seen. The Station Strangler had found his new killing fields. All of the rest of his victims would be dumped in these dunes, and the area would forever be synonymous with the horror that had taken place there. The discovery of so many bodies in such a short space of time whipped the community into a frenzy. They demanded that the police start to take the murders of their children seriously. There were many more missing boys, and the public started to conduct searches of the dunes themselves. The local police force attempted to work with the community, and on the weekend following the discovery of Donovan and Jeremy's bodies, an organized search was conducted with police officers, members of the South African Army, and community members. 8 more bodies were found. Following the horrific discoveries of the weekend search, a 14-man special task team was established in February 1994, called the Station Strangler Squad. The forensic psychology team on the squad requested the assistance of Robert Resler, the renowned American profiler who is known for being the pioneer of criminal profiling. He agreed to come to South Africa to assist, but the decision was taken not to bring him to the country until after the elections, as the political turmoil and violence around it was too much of a risk to Resler's safety. Pistorius's profile stated that the Station Strangler would be of the same racial group as the victims, and she believed that he lived within the same community. He would be aged between 25 and 30, and Pistorius would later clarify that she had arrived at this age group because most serial killers start killing in their early 20s, and considering the first murders had been in 1986, that would put him in that age bracket. He would be employed in a position of authority, like a teacher, policeman, preacher, or social worker. He would be single, homosexual, and possibly still living with his family. Pistorius profiled the killer as an intelligent man who would, at the very least, be bilingual and dress neatly. He would prefer the company of children over adults, and would drive a vehicle which had been resprayed to change the color at least once. Pistorius believed that the killer would have been sexually molested by a family member at a young age. In a move which was a first for South African law enforcement, Pistorius's profile was released to the media. It was a risky move, but the squad felt that they had little choice. They had to arrest the station strangler before he struck again. Sadly, this would not be the case, as young Elroy van Roy would be found murdered in March of that year. Elroy's murder, though, would add another piece to the puzzle, as for the first time in the series, an eyewitness came forward claiming to have seen the station strangler with Van Roy on the day of his death. She described a man with a dark complexion and an afro-like hairstyle. The man had a scar on his cheek. An identikit was developed and released along with Pistorius's profile. On the 12th of April 1994, a nurse at a psychiatric facility picked up a newspaper and looked at the identikit on the front page. She then read the profile of the serial killer being hunted. She immediately contacted police, stating that she believed one of the patients in the clinic she worked at was the station strangler. Norman Simons, later known as Afzal Sarfaraz Norman Simons, after his temporary conversion to the Muslim faith, was born on the 12th of January 1967 in Greenpoint, Cape Town. Simons was the product of an interracial relationship, which in South Africa at the time was illegal. His childhood was tumultuous, and as a toddler, he was sent to live with his grandparents in the Eastern Cape, where he would be raised in their Xhosa traditions. He would be passed between relatives in the Eastern Cape, Johannesburg, and Durban throughout most of his childhood, before eventually returning to Cape Town as a teenager to live with his mother, her new husband, and his older brother. Simons fit the profile like a glove. He was unmarried, a teacher, and still lived with his family. His friends stated that he was homosexual. Simons was highly intelligent, spoke 7 languages, listened to classical music, and dressed impeccably. He volunteered in an organization that helped ex-convicts rehabilitate into society. He claimed to have been sexually abused by his older brother when he was a teenager. After the telephone call from the psychiatric nurse, Simons was brought in for questioning. Instead of answering questions, Simons offered to write his life story for police. They gave him a pen and paper, and he proceeded to start writing. When he was done, it was late at night, and as he was not officially under arrest yet, Kotze asked Simons if he'd like to sleep in one of their caravans for the night. He agreed and was placed under armed watch. On the morning of the 13th of April 1994, Simons was arrested in connection with all the murders except Elroy van Roy's, as police claimed to still be building a case against him for that murder. During his initial few days in custody, Simons confessed that he had been killing children since 1986. He would later retract this confession, only to confess again and offer to show police where he had dumped all of the bodies. To ensure that there was no chance of a defense lawyer claiming that police had shown him where the scenes were, an officer with no knowledge of the case was brought in to accompany Simons as he pointed out the scenes. The journey through Mitchell's Plain was undertaken in the very early hours of the morning to avoid the community finding out that they had a suspect out in the open. Simons took the police to several of the scenes and then told them that he wanted to show them a body they hadn't found yet. He pointed out a scene in the dunes, and police searched the entire area. Some articles of children's clothing were found, but no body. Police would later say that there are wild dogs that frequent the area, and it is possible, according to them, that they had scavenged the remains. Simons was taken for a full psychiatric evaluation after his arrest, and while he was diagnosed with several personality disorders and depression, he was ultimately not found to be mentally ill to the extent that could be used as a defense for his actions. As much as the community were relieved to finally have the man who had haunted their nightmares for 8 years in custody, they were equally shocked to see who had been arrested. Simons had been well respected in the community and loved by his pupils. A co-worker remembered an occasion when one of their students had undergone open heart surgery, and Simons had volunteered to sit by the child's bedside so that the mother could go home and rest for a while. Parents of the murdered children came forward with stories of their children having been familiar with Simons. Donovan Swartz's mother claimed that even though her son had not attended the school that Simons taught at, she realized after he was arrested that her son knew him. Donovan would play cricket with Simons after school, and he would sometimes take Donovan and a few other boys to the beach. Donovan had come home with 2 brand new cricket bats and cricket balls. When Stella asked where they had come from, Donovan said Mr. Simons had given them to him. On the 15th of June 1995, Norman Simons was found guilty of the murder of Elroy van Roy. He was sentenced to 25 years for his murder and 10 years for kidnapping. He was remanded to Drakensberg Correctional Facility to serve his sentence. His defense lawyer, Koos Low, was just as adamant, and in 1998 he brought Simon's case to the Court of Appeals. The appeal ended with Simon's sentence being increased to life. DNA technology in 1994 was very limited, but when the inquest was held in 2005, it was possible to extract DNA from some of the very old, degenerated samples and compare them to the known samples, including Simon's. Semen that was found on the back of Jeremy Smith's underpants was tested. It did not match Simon's. Semen found on Elroy van Rooy's underpants also did not match Simon's. The eyewitness was further brought into doubt when it was revealed that she had pointed out that the hair of the man she had seen with Elroy that day was different to Simon's. The man she had seen had a large afro-like haircut, while Simon's was short. This seemed a small inconsistency until a photograph of Simon's was presented to the inquest. The photograph was taken on the morning of Elroy's murder. Simon's had gone to register as a police reservist to assist with the station strangler searches. As part of this registration, his photo was taken, which showed him with short hair. Unless his hair grew within hours into an afro, there is very little chance that he was the same man eyewitnesses had seen. Koos Low had also discovered that someone else had seen Elroy that day. The George family was familiar with Elroy from the neighborhood and saw him on the train that afternoon. They stated that he was alone, with no strange man that they could see in sight. When asked where he was going, Elroy had said he was going to see his aunt in Firgrove. An uncle of his had allegedly also been on the same train and interacted with Elroy, as he was also going to visit the same woman. Two men came forward to the inquest to state that they believed they had been the station strangler's first attempted victims. As young boys in the 1980s, the children had been abducted and sodomized by a stranger in Mitchell's Plain. The attack had exactly the same MO as the station strangler murders, but these boys knew Simons at the time and said that he was not their attacker. In 2015, Norman Simons applied for parole. His application was declined. In 2016, a self-confessed and convicted paedophile, Brian Schofer, was found hanging in the police cells at Lentegeur police station. 58-year-old Schofer had been arrested just days before for the sexual assault of a 17-year-old boy who was living with him at the time. Brian Schofer's arrest had been surrounded by much controversy. He had been released from his initial sentence for molestation and sodomy in 2010. And while he was initially under the watch of a parole officer, he managed to surround himself with children again. He started advertising online to tutor children, and although at the time of his arrest, he claimed that all the parents of the students he tutored knew very well that he had a previous history of sex crimes, this would turn out to be very untrue. It also emerged that he had managed to secure a job at a Cape Town primary school shortly after leaving jail, although he was only there for a few months. Both landlords also stated that they believed Schofer was the real station strangler. He had reportedly lived in Mitchell's Plain during the same period as the strangler was active there. He was a teacher. He had also lived in Strand. Schofer had claimed that his paedophilia stemmed from a sexual abuse he endured as a child by his uncle. He said that his father had been aware that his uncle was raping him, but he had ignored it. Besides the claims made by his landlords, Schofer was made aware shortly before his suicide that he was going to be charged with a rape case in Steenberg, a sexual assault in Mitchell's Plain, a sexual assault in Hanover Park, and 18 cases of sexual assault involving street children in Strand, where he used to reside. Schofer served his initial sentence in the same prison as Norman Simons. The case of the station strangler is an absolute rabbit hole. Just when you think you're getting to the bottom of it, the tunnel of truth takes another turn, and you end up back where you started, just a little more uncertain. There may not be physical evidence to prove that Norman Simons was the station strangler, but there are also far too many connections for me to ignore. His personal contact with so many of the boys that were murdered or went missing could be considered to be an act of grooming. While it is not uncommon for people to make false confessions, whether it's under duress or simply for their own, sometimes incomprehensible reasons, it is rather rare for someone to confess and retract their confession twice. For me, the real tragedy here is not that one man may have unfairly lost his freedom, while that of course would be tragic enough. For me, the real tragedy is that 22 children lost their lives in the most horrific way.